our little quick disclaimer again, and then we'll get started. I always laugh at this one. We are not attorneys, although there may be some on there, but there's actually not any on tonight. And everything discussed is just personal opinions and may not stand up in court. Our hope is that we can open the discussions up to the broader audience and have these ideas recorded for the next generation. There are some great high-profile boundary surveyors and even some college students from across the country on this Zoom meeting, and I hope that we can all gain a bit of knowledge from these discussions. And of course, it's a roundtable, so our roundtables are not going very well. It's been about a 2 or 3 person roundtable. So, but please chime in and add some input as much as you can every week that you feel comfortable doing and talking about, and even just questions that you have, bring them up, right? So we can talk about them as a group. So tonight is chapter 5, and it's other types or species of evidence. So what do we got? When we first jumped on, Trent's like, I did not like this chapter. It was not very fun. So I have to agree. So we'll see how we can get through it tonight. But let's.
Well, I think the authors even agree too, right? They even say in the first paragraph, the end of the first paragraph, we cannot teach this area. So I mean, we might as well just close the book and walk away, right?
Meeting's done. We're done. Love it.
Yeah, I think I've mentioned here a lot of times that as I made that transition from field rodman to crew chief to drafter to licensed surveyor, as I went through that progression, I no one ever really sat me down and said, okay, here's how you evaluate the evidence. I knew how to collect it, and all of a sudden I'm licensed and I've got to evaluate it, right? And this chapter there's a ton in here of, I think they're just little food for thought nuggets, right? If you encounter this, here's some things to think about. Like you encounter a blaze tree, here's some things to think about. Here's stuff to look for. Here's how you do it. But without getting out in the field and actually looking at the tree or evaluating that evidence project to project, this really is kind of a harder one to teach the theory of, because this is a practice chapter. You've got to go out there and try it, because you've got to take that evidence, you've got to gather it and then evaluate it. But what they're trying to do is the chapters we've talked about before. We've talked about words, we've talked about technology, we even looked at just the scope and nature of evidence. What is evidence in general? We've gone through in our discussions here, we've looked at kind of some court rulings, we've looked at a couple other separate manuals to look at, right? We've some extracurricular reading that talked about evidence in the courts and things like that. So this is just trying to wrap all those discussions up. And a lot of these principles we've kind of hit in our discussions, and they're just trying to kind of do that other catch-all. So there's a couple things that popped out to me, but I'm, like Trent said, I'm really kind of hoping for your guys' help as we go through this, because this is going to be, and I hate it too. This is why I hate it is when we sit in our conferences and things like that. I really hate when we have all those, well, what if this, what if that, because you can go down 1,000 rabbit holes and maybe not even learn anything that applies to you. But that's what tonight needs to be. So we definitely need your guys' help to start, what if, or this is what I've experienced. This is a unique thing I saw. So we can kind of, the idea is that when we encounter it, we have a frame of reference to look at the evidence and see what other evidence might be missing or that we could find to add into our pile here. So to kind of get us started off here, just 5.1, the introduction to this chapter. I read the end of the first paragraph. We cannot teach this area. We can only point out guidelines that the student and the surveyor can learn. And then the third paragraph, this is an area where only experience can be the teacher. No surveyor can appreciate the fact that an ancient fence line may be aged, or that a blaze or scribe mark might be accurately, though perhaps not precisely, determined. One cannot appreciate the determining species of a stump hole from a few charcoal fragments that were recovered in the course of searching for an original corner or bearing tree. A surveyor may be a preeminent measure of distance, able to use the most current and sophisticated surveying and electronic equipment, but until the art and science of the interpretation of other evidence are mastered, the surveyor will never be capable of conducting retracement surveys. So let's just kind of do like we've done the past couple chapters. I think what we'll do is we'll just kind of read through the principles. And then what I'm hoping is your participation is let's take maybe a list of things that popped out to you, any principles you want to discuss or look at further. But I think the best way to approach this chapter, because it is so what if, is as we read through these principles, maybe make a note down. This is one I have a story for. This is one I want to discuss. This is one I want to learn more from. And we'll take that list of what pops out to you guys as kind of our talking points today, instead of trying to go through the chapter completely, because we could split this over 3 nights, or we could take 10 minutes on it. So let's go from there. So I'll go read through these principles real fast for us. And again, think about ones that you might have a story for or might want to discuss more. So principle number 1, for a survey to be a consideration as part of a conveyance, it must be called for by the conveyance, or it must be identified by law as part of the conveyance proceedings. As an exception, in a few states, surveys conducted shortly after the conveyance is created are considered as contemporaneous with the conveyance. Principle 2, the evidence of intent of any survey called for in a conveyance is to be interpreted from the map of the survey, the field notes of the survey, and the acts of the surveyor, not from the unwritten, unexpressed intent of the surveyor. Principle 3, generally for a monument to be a controlling and considered as evidence, the monument must be called for in the written evidence, proving the conveyance, or it must have been required by law. In some states, a call for a specific survey may also be considered a call for monuments set by that survey. The call for a monument is a call for the exact spot originally occupied by the monument as of the date of the written conveyance. Principle number 4, no one corner or monument recited in a description has any greater dignity or legal weight than any other corner or monument recited in the same description. Principle 5, for an absolute location of a parcel, every survey of a conveyance must start from evidence that proves the original position of all the corners called for in the description, and that must be positively related to the written record that created the parcel. Principle 6, the fewer number of the original monuments of the parcel found and positively identified, the less certain the location of the original parcel. Principle 7, for an original monument to be of value and controlling, it must be located at the same spot occupied as of the date of the deed. The exception is waters that are subject to riparian doctrines. Principle 8, witness objects called for by writings, if found undisturbed, are conclusive evidence proving the original corner locations and have the same weight and dignity as the object that was set to identify the corner. Principle number 9, other than the original monument, the best evidence of a monument's original position is a continuous chain of history by acceptable records, usually written back to the time of the original survey and its monumentation. Principle 10, in considering evidence of bearing trees and line trees called for in an original survey, a surveyor should always have the belief that the evidence of the original survey will still be present and it can be recovered. Principle 11, in general, but not always, the county surveyor's records or city engineer's record are prima facie evidence, whereas those of private surveyors are not. Principle number 12, witness evidence or testimony may be used to locate the former position of a corner monument, but the witness evidence cannot refute a found, undisturbed monument called for by a written conveyance. Principle 13, passing calls for objects do not have a high ranking in surveys. Passing calls are those calls for surveyed objects along a line. A passing call does not determine the start or terminus of a line and should not be given dignity of a location monuments. Principle 14, evidence of possession representing the location of corners and original survey lines may be used as form of evidence to prove original survey lines. Principle 15, common report or reputation The location of the position of the original monuments or former monument positions may be proved by parole evidence, testimony or evidence, but title to land can never be proved by reputation or parole evidence, in that it can only be proved by documentary service. Principle 16, fences that are not recited in a description are only one form of evidence to prove boundaries. Taken alone, they do not and cannot constitute proof of title or boundary lines. Fences are only one form of evidence of possession. And finally, principle 17, all original corners have equal weight in location of the parcel. No one is controlling, and they must be considered as evidence of that survey. This principle applies to both GLO and meets and bounds surveys. Okay, catch my breath here for a second. And I don't know if I've ever shared this. I also teach principle, let's see, Patrick says principle 4 is kind of funny. It says, I always align my tracks up looking for the point of beginning first, and I've always given a little bit more weight if found. From Texas Principle 13, if you find a passing call but not the point of terminus, you hold that line and distance. Okay, thanks, Patrick. We'll throw that on the list. Is there anyone else that has? Let's throw them in the chat or start talking here, and let's kind of make a list of what we want to go through and how we want to approach this chapter.
I'm thinking your conversation that you had about your survey earlier and some of the evidence and your encroachments and stuff that you talked about your survey earlier, Trent. Maybe might roll into some of these principles too.
Absolutely. We'll use that as an example. I'll kind of give a quick rundown for those that weren't there for that conversation. Anyone else have a principle or story they'd want to share that covers a principle? Okay, sounds good. Well, let me start. Let me just share my little example here, and we'll use this to kind of address some of these. And we'll jump into Patrick's comments there. So I was telling Trent and Connie, I just had to do the uncomfortable thing as a surveyor and give kind of final notice to a client. So I did a survey. It started back in about October of last year. It was just it was a simple lot survey. She felt like the neighbor was encroaching on them as they were trying to build a fence. The neighbor was, and then my client was rebuilding an old deck that had completely fallen down. So I get the call to go out there and do the survey so that she can rebuild her deck. And she had already rebuilt a portion of her deck, supposedly in the exact same spot that the original deck was. And so we tied to there was no centerline monuments for the subdivision, so we tied to section corners. We traversed back to her house, and in doing the actual field work around her home, we found 2 original rivets in the sidewalk, the front corners. And so from there, those rivets, the bearing of those rivets was equal to the front right-of-way bearing. This original surveyor that did this subdivision had a general practice of setting rivets 3 feet off the front property corners. In Utah, we generally set them up in the curb, somewhere in the curb. So there's not a good distance, right? Here's the corner, we go down 10 feet to the rivet or whatever it is. It's set on line. Well, this survey had a really great habit, and there's a bunch of other surveys in the area that show that he comes off 3 feet off the right-of-way line of the lot and sets his rivets, which fit the evidence going from the section corners for that area. So it was a really cut and dry one for me that I could take those rivets, I could take my section ties, square up the lot. It's a square lot. It's like 90 feet by 150 feet. I mean, just simple as they get. But in doing so, her new deck was about 1.5 feet over the property line. But there's no other evidence of occupation or anything along the disputed boundary. So, we submit our evidence, give her a preliminary copy of the survey, and she goes dark on me for a long time. So I'm trying to collect, and finally I reached out to her. I said, okay, look, a few months have gone by. I'm collecting this. Like, I'm going to pass this on to our lawyers to give a final notice here. We're done. We're not going to file the survey. All those type of things. And so we've had some back and forth, and this was my final one of just saying, okay, look, I'm sorry you were encroaching, and I know you don't like the answer that you were encroaching, but here's the evidence I have of why you are. The found original monuments, the 2 rivets that jive with other surveys and surveyors in the area, a back fence, chain link fence along the back property line that matches occupation. The opposite side that we're looking at also has a wooden fence that matches the property line's occupation, but then our one line does not, right? It had no other evidence of occupation. It's on a hillside, and so that's why the client thought that for all these other reasons, her old deck there would have been evidence of occupation, other than the old deck's not there. There was no way for me to determine where that was. But the new deck was definitely, based off of all of these factors, she was definitely encroaching. Zambrana, you have your hand up there. You just muted yourself.
As a surveyor, I heard that having conveying that a client has an encroachment is a matter of law. You just had to be neutral at all times. So please clarify me if we have the ability to, as a surveyor, to convey encroachment without stepping into the area of the legal side. Thank you.
Yeah. So that is our job, is to locate those property lines on the ground and convey the evidence of those. So if there is encroachment, particularly in this case where we were looking for encroachments, I would say that yes, we have the obligation then to disclose those encroachments. Different surveyors on a lot survey might just show very simple lines of the lot and here's the corners, we set it and leave it, or some go into tons of details of every tree and bush and occupation evidence there might be. So you'll see different levels of surveys that surveyors do. But I would say when you're particularly looking for encroachments, that's when you show it on both sides, because I am neutral, right? We are neutral as surveyors. We are just taking that deed and attempting to show where it is on the ground, and then show the evidence around that line. That there's a lot of things in our contract that we might stop. Maybe we do find the encroachment, and your client doesn't want property corner set. They don't want to pursue it anymore. They don't want to start a fight with their neighbor. There's a lot of probably other caveats to that of, okay, we found the encroachment. Do we finish the survey? I would say that you're not necessarily required to inform the neighbor and create problems, but if you are finishing your survey, you are required to show all evidence that you used in determining that property line.
There's something I would like to add regarding encroachments. When we do specify that something is an encroachment, we do in that terminology specify that we are certain of the ownership of whatever is crossing the property line. So if you have a house and there is a line going through the house and clipping it by 4/10 or half a foot,
no,
it's gonna be fairly obvious that you know who the house belongs to, and you might have a testimony of the house owner, and you know which parcel he owns, and you know that he owns the house, and you're relatively safe making an assessment that, okay, that house encroaches on a next door property. Other times you have a fence that, let's say it's a substantial, costly fence, something ornamental, that meanders around the property line a little bit back and forth. You don't necessarily know at certain times who actually owns that fence. You just know that it's crossing the property line. So 1 minute it's on its own land, 1 minute it's on somebody else's land, but you really don't know who the fence belongs to. In that case, you want to identify that that fence is crossing the property line, but not necessarily make a statement that you're certain of the ownership of that land fixture. So there's finesse to using the term encroachment versus just making a statement that, look, there is a land fixture or something which is crossing the property line where we are uncertain of the ownership. So you let somebody else decide on the actual ownership and decide whether that's an encroachment, or if they already have an agreement that, yes, this is okay, verbal license to use it, or whatever the legally, whether they're allowed to do this or not. So we're identifying the position of the physical feature and letting somebody else at times decide the ownership of that physical feature.
Yeah, like in the case of a fence, I would say that's displaying evidence, right? But on a house or even a deck in this case, right, the ownership is easy to make because it's
Certainly.
their deck. They're using it. They're enjoying it. There's no
Yeah.
question that whose deck or
Yeah,
home
like
that is.
they have possession of it, and it's very clear.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then it's safe to make that statement. Or the risk you expose yourself by making that assertion is very low and acceptable.
Yep.
Yep.
Absolutely.
We've
Thank
had
you.
something. We've had something on those same lines, Connie, like attorney looking to know who owns the wall, right? Well, we don't know who built the wall, so you don't know who owns the wall at that point, right? And so, in instances like that, we've sent them to go back to like the county building permit, who pulled the wall, who pulled the permit for the wall, right, and that kind of stuff. So, because their issue was who's going to pay for the maintenance of the wall when it was starting to deteriorate and that kind of stuff. So,
yeah, this comes in question a lot on ALTA surveys for us too, and I'm sure for other people too, where you're identifying where the features are on the ground with respect to the property line, and you don't want to get in the business of determining their ownership and be responsible for decisions of who should maintain or rebuild them or whatever else they need to do with them.
And I can't remember what item number it is, but evidence of party walls on ALTA surveys.
10, I think it is 10.
Yeah. So that was that was a great question about what evidence do we look for and portray? Is it an encroachment? Is it a lot of this is just markers to search for more evidence, right? You find a fence that meanders, and depending on the criticalness of that fence, do you go back to both landowners and say, who owns this fence? Did you put it in? Did your neighbor put it in? Who's been maintaining? There might be reason to go back and search for more, and we've kind of looked at that. And this chapter, you'd almost apply. I think it was principle 13. Passing calls for objects do not have high ranking in surveys, right? So they're talking about like an old GLO note, right? Thence 13 chains over a hill, across a creek, 40 chains set a monument, right? Those passing calls don't hold a lot of weight. Passing calls for objects do not have high ranking in surveyors. Passing calls are those calls for surveyed objects in a line. And so they're evidence, right? That's not proof of anything. It's a great way to apply that principle. So with that, we can kind of use my example a little bit to cover some more of this, but let's jump into Patrick's principle here. Patrick said, principle 4 is kind of funny. I always align my tracks up looking for the point of beginning first, and have always given a little bit more weight if found. So let's read principle 4 again. It says, no one corner monument recited in a description has any greater dignity or legal weight than any other corner or monument recited in the same description. Patrick, you care to chime in and kind of talk us through what your thought process is when you hold them? And I'm we're not going to judge saying you're right or wrong, but I think this is a great thing to have some discussion. So you want to jump in and talk about what you're thinking with that one? You still on here, Patrick? I don't even see him in the list anymore.
Yeah, he's there.
Okay.
Patrick, if you're here, I think you're muted.
Oh, no mic.
Oh, no, Mike.
Oh, dang. Okay.
Denied.
Oh, that's okay then. Well, since you have no mic and way of defending yourself, we're going to sit here and judge and critique your survey
There you go.
principles.
That's awesome.
You know, I would say, just jumping off, I probably do the same to some extent, because you've got to start somewhere. But I can think of dozens of examples where once I get the deed punched in and start looking at evidence, or even start finding original corners or monuments, and John Stahl schooled us on all that a couple weeks ago, using the right terms, corners or monuments. You know, I've often found the biggest error in my ties back to section corners. The boundary might be really tight and easy to do, but because of the way they were measuring, you know, half a mile to a mile away on older deeds, that's often where I'm rejecting in my survey the description or a portion of the description, holding the four corners of the deed, the four corners of the boundary, if you were, as more gospel. So I get the idea of trying to hold the point of beginning first. I guess you just have to weigh that with any other evidence found, right? Maybe you don't have a good, you know, depending on what it calls. I know in Texas is different than, I've worked a little bit in Texas, and I know how original point of beginning and other monuments are called for out there, which is different than the rest of the country. And I don't even know the right terms for what they use, but it is definitely different than what I'm used to in a PLSS state, where we're coming along a section line, than some other bearing a distance to the point of beginning and around the property. Anyone else care to chime in? How do you guys hold the point of beginning or look at that evidence? You guys ever hold one corner over another? Kind of contrary to number 4, or do something that proves number 4? Okay.
It's always so quiet.
Good. I need your guys' help on this one, because we could sit here and go through all the what ifs. Like, let's go read all the portions about blaze trees, right? And let's spend the next hour doing that. But
Yeah.
Well, you know, speaking of number 4, I struggle with that often, because sometimes you develop a picture in your head of how you think they went about surveying a certain part of the property, and we all know that as you're out there doing things, you're at the higher level of attention with certain points than you are with others. And then, you know, as you're looking through it, and some parts fit and some parts don't quite fit, and you're trying to develop that story in your head, it's so easy to fall prey to starting to look for a confirmation for the bias that you've developed in your head. And you have to stop and think about, you know, is there a legal precedent for this? Am I doing the right thing by kind of blowing off this monument because I really don't think they paid a lot of attention by setting it, and when they set it, and or maybe it was on a difficult terrain, or you know, you're looking for reasons to disregard it. And that's easy to get in a battle with yourself regarding, oh, is there common sense to this, versus, okay, the legal precedent is the monument holds no matter what.
yeah.
Or not necessarily no matter what, but, you know, within the criteria, and the monument fits all the criteria except the common sense is telling you no, 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 no. And I know I'm talking a little bit too hypothetical too.
Yeah, no, I think you're hitting it right, Connie, and Trent just highlighted. It says, yet in meets and bounds states, in the location of a meets and bounds parcel, a surveyor may commence at any corner recited in the deed to locate the parcel of land. No single corner or monument recited in the description has any greater control than any other. And often, I know we've talked about this a little bit, is sometimes you got a really difficult deed that doesn't have complete calls. And so when you're mathematically drawing it in say a CAD program, you might start at the point of beginning and go around and get to a point where you can't stop, right? And so this principle in proof, you can go back to the point of beginning and come back the other way, right? And in theory, you should be able to close out that parcel because everything, at face value is all equal. So if you're having trouble retracing a deed or replotting a deed, that proves the principle for is you can come from any direction and start anywhere to close something out. Then the difficulty comes of placing that on the ground, right? And I think that's what Connie was saying is once you place it on the ground, look at all the evidence, maybe the point of beginning doesn't really matter because the monuments show a different story or occupation shows a different story. And that's kind of some of the stuff we've talked about over the last couple of weeks is what we are doing is showing occupation on the ground, where the deed falls, right? And we use that example. I had that one where all the properties, remember on the east side of the section 36, all those properties were shifted south about 30 feet. And occupation all the way through there matched it. I think it was about a month ago we talked about that one. But when you look at a point of beginning or a section tie call or occupation or what our survey is, my survey says this is occupation. It fits the deed, even though our tie to the section is wrong. And then we get into some of the other more difficult tasks of how do we correct that in the legal record for future records. And so I think that fits as well to this principle 4. So there we go. Anything else on this one? I think we've covered it pretty well. Okay, let's jump over to principle 13 then. Patrick says, so if you find a passing call but not the point of terminus, you hold that line of distance. Again, this is why this chapter is so very difficult, because the answer is it depends. Because again, we're looking at so much evidence as the survey as a whole that it's going to depend survey to survey exactly how you hold that. But you use those calls if you can find, like in this one. Let me open up over to 519 here. They gave a great example of a.
I was gonna say I got it up on the screen.
I'm on one screen today, so I only see about half of it because I've got my chat and my videos up. But,
oh, sorry.
No, that's on me. So I didn't plug in my second screen today.
You're good.
And
I think, I guess this is where a lot of the meets and bound states come into play too, right? I mean, we don't, outside of the original GLO surveys and the GLO field notes trying to reestablish some, PLSS corners, this isn't something that really topo calls are on our legal descriptions, typically out west, right? Or more PLSS states. And I would say even that, because all that stuff is, commencing at a section cornered along the north line and then down, meets and bounds and around and however. So I don't know, at least, for West Coast, I don't know how this theory would come into play too much other than GLO notes, right? So I've never really seen any legal descriptions where we've got some topo calls in somebody's just private land legal description.
Yeah, topo calls not so much, but fence line calls a lot more, right?
Yeah. You got fence lines? Yeah, see, we don't even get a lot of that. But.
Yeah, we get quite a few, and I'll put those in description occasionally when it's needed. And I had one, one of those surveys that come back to bite you where I regretted not calling a fence line out, and I should have. It was a quarter line and the fence was the occupation. There was no section corners east of that line set. So some people were holding 1320 and some people were holding the fence. And so then you had some disagreement in evidence. But I think this example here where they've got, I guess we'll just go ahead and read it here. His example, I want to cut out part of it here, but I think it's the second paragraph is the best one. We'll go through the whole thing here. On the west line of section 6, Larson went north from the southwest corner thereof to the last recognizable call in the government field notes beyond the Garcia River. Then, there being no further ascertainable calls except that of north, he continued north to the township line. On the east line of section 6, Larson followed the calls from the southeast corner of said section north to the Garcia River. He could find no recognizable evidence calls beyond that, so he followed the only call he could be sure of, and that was north to the township line. Cummins apparently had made no attempt to follow the calls even as far as the Garcia River. He started right out at the southeast corner of section 6 and went on a straight line about 40 degrees off a true north direction, ran many more chains than the notes called for and in a different direction, and came out on a township line a mile westerly from where he would have had gone north all the way from the corner he started from. That's not the one I was thinking of, but we'll keep going here. There can be no doubt, and I understand all parties to agree, that the government field notes beyond the Garcia River are grossly incorrect as to distances and consequently as to courses. It does not seem possible that such errors could occur by one in the field. One can guess that parts of said lines were not actually run, but only estimated from afar. Not good estimates either. It is the duty of a later surveyor to try and retrace the steps of the original surveyor where such is possible. This Larson attempted to do. Kenneth Cummins found no relation between the line ran and the calls in the field notes. Larson followed the call north. Cummins did not. It is pointed out in his closing point was between two streams and a spur, which description is found in some of the field notes with reference to other political subdivision. However, this is far from being conclusive when we ascertain that in order to get there, we must go along a line which leads us to a point a mile away from where it would be if the line went straight north from the southeast corner to the northeast corner thereof, said section 6. And where the distance is so far off the distance calls in the field notes, and where it is not shown there were other places along the township line that could not qualify as coming along with the same description. There is not much left to go on in that regard. So I think that's just kind of what we're talking about. The challenge with this is you have to look at, as a modern surveyor, you almost have to go both routes. Reading this, and we can keep reading and looking into it more, but you have to go both routes and apply evidence to both and see which one fits. Just holding one is poor survey practice, but holding two is definitely the more difficult, consumptive method. But it really probably is the most correct way, being a Monday morning quarterback, on this example.
One thing that stuck out to me when I was reading that, look at that. Another interesting California case, something side note, right? Took 340 trial days, 36,302 transcript pages, 844 exhibits. This one caught me. One surveyor, William Waddles, was cross-examined for 46 days.
Is that the Waddles from the book, How to Write Legal Descriptions?
So that was reference 32. That Chandler versus Hibbard.
Yeah. Yeah. There you go. That one. Yeah. 1958. So that's crazy.
That really is. I guess right under there, I mean, just to kind of belabor our point, some surveyors and courts place greater weight on a locative call than they should, but those who properly use these calls as they should add a greater dimension to their surveying skills. So it's balancing. It's all about balance. I think that's what this chapter really talks about. It's all about balance and how we approach these.
So question on this one, is he saying that there's two ways to interpret? So one guy goes west and another guy goes north?
That's the way I'm that's why I'm understanding. One goes north because that's the bearing call, and one guy goes more westerly, right? Because that's the natural monuments call, right? The passing calls, as it were.
Ooh. That's a hard question though, because don't we usually consider a natural monument to be of the highest order?
The difference in this, I think, is a passing call is not a natural monument. You're not going north, 0 degrees, 14 minutes to a tree, right? You're going north, like in the GLO example. That's what I was looking for in the it gave one that you're going, like if you read GLO notes, they went north along a creek, over a hill, 40 chains, and set the monument, right? Those passing calls, might not be that accurate or correct today when we look at it. But if you're going north to a very positive and sure natural monument, you're going north to the south line of a creek. You're going north to an oak tree with a blaze and a whatever. You're going north to a cedar post. Those are calls to natural natural or artificial monuments. He argues that point a little bit in this chapter. That's very different than those passing calls. Going that's some sort of northerly direction along a hill, right, or along a tree line that changes over time, or may not be accurate when we're retracing it. I think that's the distinction that this principle is making.
And the more calls, the better. Right now I'm in a field survey, and it's easy, and it's shocking me because I'm in the flatlands of California, the Central Valley. And one thing that's shocking me about this survey is all the monuments in the roadway are just fine. I'm finding all of them, but then I have monuments that are located along a canal bank. And I'm actually sitting here going, okay, now what I have to do is I have to get broader. And so I'm finding, other section corners and different things that exist on, maintained roadways. And then I'm actually estimating, okay, it's around here. And based on the last calls that I've seen in a record of survey, right, something filed with the county, it's within 10 feet of this point up here. And I mean, for me, that's a lot easier than it's within 85 feet based on if they used a compass and the chain. And so, but just the perpetuation of the monuments and getting out there and realizing, okay, I'm looking for a 24-inch oak tree and all I can see is an 84-inch oak tree. No mention of a canal, no mention of, mention of certain fence posts, but this is all done in, 1980. And I mean, even ag land in the middle of nowhere changes within the next, 40, 42 years, like it has. And then I went to another one. So that's the north corner of section 23. And then I go to the northeast corner of that. And I'm realizing that corner has 3 calls. One, you're going to want to go, you go 111 feet west to the canal. You're going to go, 52 feet to the east, to the power line that runs east. And then you're going to go 4 feet north to the fence line that runs north. And all it is just a forest of trees, right? These row trees that they plant. There's no fence. I don't see any power line. I mean, I see a power line, but it's off it's like 800, 900 feet away. And then I have a canal bank, but the canal's running right up and down the project. It's nice in this area because I can kind of see trees and stuff like that. But when I'm sitting there with just 3 calls on a previous survey for a corner record, I'm going, I'm gonna have to get evidence of other ones, do a single proportionate, And then if that doesn't work, I don't even know if I'm going to get the double proportionate on the north-south to tie that in. But yeah, I wanted to bring that up, and sometimes there's just not enough evidence that, you know, on the paper that I might, you know, if that fails, then, you know, I don't even want to talk about that, tracing down the old field notes to setting up these section corners.
Yeah, that's the fun of being a surveyor, right? But that's exactly what this book is trying to. I mean, that's a great what if situation. You're dealing in real life, but we could sit here and do some what ifs. Okay, what if you do a double proportion or a single proportion, or look at the mathematics, and we're going to get into that in some future chapters, the mathematics of things as evidence. But there's a lot to kind of take in there. Is okay, what other evidence? You know, we talked about this in the past chapters. Okay, the base evidence isn't there. Are there previous tenants, homeowners, landowners, you know, surveyors? What can you pull in to start, you know, start looking at solving your issue? You know, can someone just walk up and like, oh yeah, I already know Grandpappy, you know, John put it in here, you know, in the 70s, and we monumented with the survey in the 80s, and yeah, we had to, you know, we had a fire come through and took out all the trees. So we plowed it all and replanted. And I know it's not here, but you know, we moved the creek or the canal because of this reason, right? There's all these different situations we can come up with that, you know, there's just no way of knowing without being out there. But I think that's, again, I said this at the beginning, that's what this book has started getting me to do, is open my vision a little bit more and be less closed-minded about what I'm seeing there. Is okay, this is a difficult task, and you definitely have a difficult task in front of you, but how do I open my mind to other forms of evidence that we can find in other calls?
Great point. Thank you, Trent.
Well, thanks for sharing, Jonathan. I appreciate it. Shane threw out here, you have to weigh the evidence and decide if there was gross error in the original survey. I think that's the hardest thing for surveyors to do. I mean, we always say follow in the footsteps of the original surveyor. We hold it sacrosanct. I mean, there is so much regard we give to those original surveys. But sometimes you do have to look at, you know, was there a gross error? But then you have to back that up with the evidence, right? Okay, well, I noted a couple principles here I wanted to chat about and kind of go through as we go through this. Principle 2, the evidence of intent of any survey called for in a conveyance is to be interpreted from the map of the survey, the field notes of the survey, and the acts of the surveyor, not the unwritten, unexpressed intent of the surveyor. So I want to address this in kind of just two forms. One, what this chapter mostly talks about is, you know, the idea of retracement surveying, right? We're looking at the evidence, we're retracing it. So I do this all the time. One of my first acts when I do research for a new project is I pull the deed and I pull the adjacent surveys, right? And sometimes I get lucky and find surveys on my parcel. Embarrassing story here. I didn't do that once. Got all the way through an Alta survey and was just finishing up the boundary. It was pretty cut and dry and easy. And I realized I didn't have my normal complement of evidence and went and pulled all the surveys and actually found a survey done by my company on that parcel 10 years earlier. I could have just done an Alta update. There was no changes to any of the on-the-ground topography, but we went through all the effort of doing a full survey just to find out. I've actually got a CAD file of that one and didn't need to actually do much. But the second part of that is, you know, many of us surveyors also do original surveys. We do subdivision plats, right? And so what evidence are we showing on that subdivision plat? We've talked a little bit in Utah. The subdivision plat goes to the recorder's office, but we should be filing a record of survey with the surveyor's office. That's how we determine the boundary then used in the subdivision plat, but that doesn't always get done. I know that's not always practiced in other parts of the country. So on that subdivision plat, how are you showing, I mean, just think about it, what evidence are you giving to the next person, right? If they had to retrace yours, what's going on there? So I'm going to read, I think what it's got on here, it's short enough, that 5.4. The survey called for cannot be interpreted in light of any secret or hidden intentions of the creating surveyor. What the surveyor did and what he or she recorded in the evidence of writings are what count. The surveyor's testimony that he or she intended to include all the lands up to the adjoiner cannot enlarge a survey to include lands that were omitted in the original survey. This was addressed in a Texas decision. The question seemed to have been whether or not the calls for course and distance or those lines or 4 lines of older surveys should prevail. Upon this question, we are of the opinion that the testimony of the surveyor stating his intention in making the survey was not admissible. In determining the location of the land in such cases, the courts seek to ascertain the true intention of the parties concerned in the survey, but the intention referred to is not that which exists only in the mind of the surveyor. When reference is made in the decisions to the intentions of the surveyor, the purpose deduced from what he did in making the survey and description of land is meant, and not one which has not found expression in his acts. Hence, if the intention of the surveyor appears from his field notes and his acts done in making the survey, his evidence to prove his intention is superfluous, while if it does not appear, it cannot control or affect the grant. The surveyor, of course, can state that his intent about things he or she actually did, but not about intent. A statement by the surveyor that a certain found monument was the one that he or she set or would have force, but a statement to refute writings would more than likely be rejected, since parole evidence is inferior to written evidence. So how do we write our descriptions? That's a great example of how do we write our descriptions. And what calls are we putting in there? Garrett threw out here, Principle 3, monuments must be called for in writings to be controlling. Most descriptions I come across don't have calls for monuments or have surveys filed. They are just a series of bearings of distances. If there are no monuments called for in the descriptions, what am I looking for? Does this immediately lead me to start considering parole evidence of the original grantor's intent or reputation of other monuments? Garrett, what area of the country do you work in? I'm guessing you're a Western states guy.
That's right. Yeah, I'm in Utah. And so vast majority of descriptions here, bearing distance, bearing distance, bearing distance to the point of beginning. There's no call for pipes. If I'm lucky, there'll be a call along a fence line, but even that is rare. And so when you're dealing with older descriptions, a lot of the time there's nothing in the writing. The more recent ones a lot of the time have subdivision plats associated with them, and so that plat will obviously call out for rebar. But most meets and bounds descriptions, the only written monument called for is going to be the PLSS monument, the section corner. Aside from that, I'm just going off of measurements.
Yeah, I mean that's a big thing in Utah, and in the Western PLSS states, because it is so tied to, a localized control network, if you will, as a single section. You do stuff in the colonial states, the meets and bounds states. That principle really applies because you are, if you ever get a chance to work in one of those states and read those descriptions, they're making calls on the meets, the bounds, the corners, the lines. They're calling to adjoiners, they're calling to, axle wheels, whatever was set back in the, 1890s when that original parcel was set up, to great granny apples, rear orchard line, and so the challenge of this book is to open this discussion to a larger audience. But I get what you're saying. I'm being a Utah guy myself. You very rarely see a found monument called a corner called. I mean, we've got to call them corners, right? They're corners. We're talking about property corners versus a monument, which is a section monuments, government monuments. But the only time I do see that called, at least locally, is if there's something in question, right? I'm not quite sure what I have, but I'm going to hold to XYZ survey company's monument because it's good enough evidence because there's no other evidence for the boundary, right? That's kind of the CYA call, if you will.
Is there absence of controlling calls too in these descriptions beyond the actual ground, beyond absence of calls to ground monuments?
That's what I was going to ask too. Like, are we double calling, right, along the north line of, or along the west line of lot 1 or whatever? Is there?
Yeah, if you're lucky, you'll
Oh,
have
wow.
calls to like senior rights.
Okay.
So, you know, I would say that's definitely more frequent than physical monuments.
Yeah.
I mean,
And that's great too. It's great to be bounding to senior rights because that does at least give you something to start looking for and something to control where you're going to be putting that boundary. But I mean, in my mind, it leads to when you don't have solid physical calls, you know, for rebar or whatever, or to cedar posts, fence posts, whatever. It leads to the issue you see of why so many surveyors are concerned to accept any evidence because we literally just have measurements. So you have people either going all the time for occupation because they don't want to upset the occupation that's on the ground, or the other surveyors that say, no, there's no fence in the writings, so I'm just going to put the exact deed calls on the ground and not accept anything else. And that's been the great part of reading this book, is understanding that there's a lot of gray area in between. There's a lot more evidence that you can accept. But when there's nothing being called for in the writings, it leaves a lot, you know, it doesn't get you pointed in any certain direction. You have to be a lot more creative in looking for evidence.
I would say
Yeah.
Nevada is similar, where we don't call to monuments either. I mean, our stuff is, like I say, beginning at the northwest corner of the section, along the north line, you know, and then, like I said before, it meets and kind of run around the description, but it's not beginning at the section corner, being a GLO breast cap, da 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 da, you know, and then east 660 to a found rebar. We don't do that either here. So
yeah, there's been a lot of discussion about that on a local level here, where there's a faction that has taken a call to a monument to have to mean a call to a physical monument on the ground, neglecting the fact that several of the authorities on boundaries in the books that they've written, they consider calls to a record position also a monument. It's classified as a record monument, and it has its own place in the hierarchy of evidence. So, and this would include, you know, a call to a section corner, no matter what monument sits at that section corner. If it's something that's been perpetuated and accepted, just stating that it's a section corner, you can find it on the ground. If you're calling to an adjoiner or to senior rights or along a right of way of a street, you're basically calling to you know, it's a call to an abutter, and you still have the clarity of interpretation, provided that eventually you find sufficient evidence in your field survey to actually locate those points on the ground. Because the same thing, calling for a monument in a very specific monument in the description, I'm talking about urban, suburban areas, doesn't really guarantee that that monument is actually going to exist on the ground. So you still need the calls to abutters to understand the intent of the description.
Well, then in Utah, you don't have to be a surveyor to write a description either.
Oh, oh my God.
So then you've
I'm
got someone,
sorry.
you know, a title company writing a description that doesn't understand monuments, or may not, you know, obviously isn't doing a survey to find what monuments are out there.
Yeah.
Our county, Clark County in Las Vegas, finally the recorder's office will not allow a recorded legal description without a stamped seal on it.
Is that just local ordinance, or does that come from a state level ordinance that's getting enforced?
Yeah, it's county code, but so Yep, they started doing that, so that's pretty cool.
Yeah, we've tried that here. It's always failed.
It's
I
always
guess, I
they
guess we're somewhat privileged in California to have that codified in the PLS Act.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
They just
Yeah,
recently
that's
started doing it
awesome.
about a year ago, and they we asked them, you know, when did this start? They're like, oh, it's always been there. We're just now enforcing it. So it's cool. Patrick's got some stuff in the chat.
Yeah, Patrick said, thence with the easterly right-of-way line of X Street northeast, a distance of 130 feet to a 5/8-inch iron rod with cap. Found at southwest corner, called 15-acre tract for the northwest corner of the herein described tract. We don't typically call out section corners, only really in West Texas. Yeah, I mean, most of Texas, Patrick, you can speak up to this. I mean, you're not really dealing with the PLSS, but maybe you can jump on and give other people perspective of how. You know, when I went out there, I was working under a.
He doesn't have a mic.
Oh, that's right. Sorry, Patrick.
Patrick's talking. He's just not talking to us.
I know.
West Texas has sections. Yeah.
So I did some stuff around Houston and Dallas, where where there aren't sections, and the Spanish land grants as well. But I found it interesting. Earth Point. If you guys ever use Earth Point, that's a great jumping off point for finding section corners and other stuff. But they have the Texas parcel sections. Patrick, throw in the chat what they're called, because my mind's going blank on that. But that was a great starting off point, because the deeds we found called to the southwest corner, such and such set of whatever parcel or land grant or area, and then we went around that way. But those were always, anytime I did surveying in Texas, we found a lot of corners, because they were called out in the deeds, they were perpetuated, and we found them exactly where we had planned to. Surprisingly so, even in the urban areas. Again, out west, sometimes those get destroyed with too much construction. I really enjoyed that time working in those. Yeah, I think it's the portions. Portions is, I think, the word I was looking for. They're all differently shaped. Yeah. Okay, some great discussion there. Thanks, guys. Did we miss anybody's? Long skinny tracks.
Yeah.
No, so the long skinny tracks along the Rio Grande. Lots of different types in Texas. Lots to learn there. The other one I had highlighted, Principle 6, I think it's just worth looking at and noting. I mean, I think this, for most of us, is a no-brainer. The less monuments you find, the less sure you are of the actual location of the parcel or the deed, right? Sorry, monuments, I should say corners. You need to get in that habit. The fewer corners or original monuments, if you're retracing a section, right? The fewer, the less certain you're going to be. No-brainer, but that's a pretty good one. Principle 7. For an original monument to be of value and controlling, it must be located at the same spot occupied as of the date of the deed. The exception is waters that are subject to riparian doctrines. And this is an interesting one that I thought I'd throw out there as some discussion, because it's saying it must be located at the same spot occupied as of the date of the deed. And so my question would be, why not just the original location? Why have they thrown in the date of the deed there? Because we look at, retracing in PLSS states, you're going back to the original location that monument holds throughout. So why are we not looking at that versus the date of the deed? Any thoughts or ideas there?
Because that's when the ownership got transferred, and that monument was relied upon to understand where the ownership lays for the new occupant.
Are we talking monuments or corners on this? Or both?
Well, if the monument in the corner coincide, then the monument was indicative of where that corner should be. And
yeah.
And it was used to take possession.
Yeah. So from a monument standpoint, there are 2 areas in northern Utah where the section corner has 3 monument locations, and you know them by their dates. So deeds written between 1950 and 1967 hold position B. I think it's before 1950's position A, and then it was moved somewhere between the 60s and the 80s, and so there's some gray area there. And then deeds written after the 80s, new deeds written after the 80s, hold to monument C, but they don't actually say which monument they hold to. And sometimes you don't know when that original one was done until you really go back in time, because as it transfers, the deed date might be last year, but the deed itself was written 40, 50, 60 years ago, and it's just been transferred. So that's why I throw that one out. It's an interesting one. It's one I deal with quite a bit working in the northern Utah area, so I like this one. It must be located in the same spot.
I've been thinking about this one a lot lately, because I find, original subdivision monuments that are good and old, and half the time they're located in the center line of the street, right? So a pipe that's in the center line of the street is subject to, or I mean, even if they're on the edge of the right of way, it's subject to disturbance over time, various things, sidewalks, big trucks, utilities, stuff like that. Now, if you have an original subdivision monument that you believe is original in the original location that's been bumped around, 2 or 3 tenths, but it's still there and it's original, and you understand that neighbors are relying on that monument for construction purposes, then my question would be, I might not have a huge problem holding that for the right-of-way line or the lot corner, even if it's off, a few tenths from where I think it ought to be based on other evidence in the neighborhood, and that's original and also original and, maybe not disturbed or fits the map better. Let's just say it like that. Sometimes you can't tell if they're disturbed or if they just happen to fit those original measurements better. And then you get to, well, I got to set the corner, the corresponding corner next door now. Now, do I set it 50 feet record distance from that monument that I know might be off a couple tenths, but it's original? Or do I set it from the other ones and say, well, yeah, I'm holding that as an original monument, but I think it might be off a hair, and I don't, you kind of get to the point where you're tripping over yourself by trying to hold an original monument and at the same time set something else that is fits the rest of the subdivision better. It gets really confusing to me. And, sometimes I want to just say, well, that centerline monument's off 2 tenths. I'm presuming that it's disturbed. But it's still an original monument that I know is original, and it's in the pretty much probably the original location. My understanding is the legal standing of original monuments is that they have no error. And then, we also get into, I'm in California, so we get into, is the movement over time gradual, or was it evulsive due to an earthquake? And so that makes it even worse. But I'm just really thinking about, one that drifts a little bit, because it's, because that happens in the world, dirt expands and contracts and stuff moves and people, I don't know. You got anything to say about that?
Good luck.
There's a book about that called The Pincushion Effect.
Yeah.
Called what?
The Pincushion Effect, right? Jeffrey Eisner's
I
book,
love
The
that book.
Pincushion Effect, yeah.
Yeah. The one thing that pops to my mind, again, I've mentioned this a couple times tonight, but the way this book has made me think about that question, right? Things like that. I don't know if you were able to join us 2 weeks ago, but in chapter 4, principle 3, I'll read it here real fast. It says, all corners and lines created by the original surveys should be equated to the standards of precision that were in effect at the time the corners were created. So with that mindset, maybe that's a different way to approach it. You know, maybe there has been drift, maybe there has been some disturbance, but at the end of the day, especially if you're looking at, you know, my tolerance is generally, before I start throwing too many worries, is about a foot. And that's just a personal one before I get too in the weeds about things. But when was that original one set? And was it set with the tolerances of that day? And yeah, maybe there's some evidence of shifting, but is it still within the tolerance that you would have expected to have seen based off of how they set that? And use that to kind of as a guide.
I would agree with that, Trent, as well.
I'd like to share a thought on this. Whenever I get in that thinking loop, I tend to like to ask myself, is this going to present a material discrepancy? Is this something that I need to decide on? And, you know, is it possibly an error? How is it affecting everybody? Let's say hypothetically we are in a suburban subdivision. You know, everybody's got 10-foot setbacks. The street are nice and wide. It was built 60 years ago, perhaps. Monument is 3500s out of place. If I hold the monument or if I hold the record, is it going to make any difference? You know, I will probably, you know, 3/10, I will declare where I found the monument. I will say it controls the road center line. You look at the lines of occupation, it falls within 1/10 or 2 of the back of the sidewalk. Do I need to worry about it? Is this affecting anybody's property values? In that case, my answer is 99% of the times, no, just it's not something I need to bother with. I'm just going to declare that there's a little bit of a difference and everybody lives with it happily ever after. We're not locating first order GPS station that the rest of the world is going to survey off of. We're just controlling, you know, the centerline monuments, assuming that the street has senior rights and it was laid out the street first and then the lots. We're just controlling the few lots, the frontage of the lots in the area. Back corners of the subdivision are going to be evaluated in their proper perspective. So I'm going to honor seniors, junior rights, or whatever exists between those tracts.
Okay.
And so are you actually on the face of the plat, are you showing that as a measured and record distance and bearing on the line?
Let's say our tolerance for subdivisions, suburban subdivisions, is about 5 to 700s. If it's less than 5 to 700s, or if it's falling within my error ellipses, which is usually 3 to 400s, I'm going to be inclined that I found that monument at the record location. And especially considering trying to take into account the expected precision of the survey at the time it was created. Are they setting things within 1/10 or are they setting things within 100? Usually it's 1/10, you know, a little older equipment. Maybe they were still taping the distances. I find something 700s out of position. I'm going to call it found at record position. If I find something at 3/10, I'm going to take a closer look and see what other evidence exists, how this fits the entire picture before I make a decision. Most likely 3/10, I will declare that there's a difference and not necessarily, you know, if it's a length of the subdivision and there's no frontage corners, other monuments, you know, I'll have to prorate the subdivision, something to that effect. Still, doing that is not going to disturb any lines of possession because we're still talking, you know, by the time you distribute it across maybe 15 lots on that stretch, you're talking 100th. Nobody's gonna care if their property line jiggled by 100th. It's not a material difference, a material discrepancy that where we're affecting somebody's ownership in a material way. And in California, material discrepancy is not defined in detail. It's left up to the surveyor to judge what constitutes a material discrepancy on case-by-case basis. So if I'm doing high rises in a very dense urban area, let's say downtown LA, with where everything is built to within a few hundreds, that might 400s might become a material discrepancy. Although I can't say that I've actually seen it happen, but I am making that allowance in my head in case to not automatically rule it out. Other times, we just had projects along Caltrans right away in Blythe, California, which is open desert, where it was routinely we started seeing, not just in our field survey, but in underlying maps historically, they're routinely finding monuments few feet out of position and accepting them. So we followed suit on what was on the precedent set in that area. So basically accepted a couple of Caltrans monuments, even though one was 1.5 feet out of position, and another, I forget what the other one was. I've done a lot of them in recent weeks. So I evaluate everything on case-by-case basis and how it fits the entirety of the evidence to decide
I'd throw out there my approach to it. I think, I agree with everything Connie said, but on a rural survey, I may not even call out any discrepancy, because in my mind, the record calls get you to that monument or the corner, right? In a very rural survey, where a foot doesn't matter, you're looking at multiple acres. I won't call out that there's any discrepancy, because any competent surveyor can take that record distance or bearing and get to the found rebar that I show on my map. And so maybe that's just kind of reiterating what Connie said, but that's just my approach on a rural one. And then on an urban one, I may still not change any sort of record calls or do record versus measured, but just show that it is off by this much. But in my narrative, I describe the who, what, when, where, and how, why. Am I holding it or am I rejecting it, and why? Even if I'm not changing a record versus measured call or an as surveyed description.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
David, did that help too with you?
Yeah, that's good. It's all good stuff. It's just, it's conversation, and I agree with what she was saying about the case-by-case basis. It's just another thing that pops up when I'm drawing a map, and I gotta, explain what I did on this corner, and it's and sometimes I'm sitting there saying, well, is this right? I feel like I'm not giving this original subdivision monument the credit it's due, but it just doesn't feel right. And I got to explain that in black and white. And that's where the rubber meets the road on a survey,
That's the hard part.
I did that recently on a subdivision where it was property line went down south towards the right of way, and then it had a little jog to accommodate it. It angled over across the corner of the top of slope, and then shot down the length of slope and teed into the right of way line. And I'm finding all these all the monuments of that subdivision in the right place. And then there's all of a sudden one monument on that little jog that's exactly 2 by 2 feet out of position. And I mean, the guys measured it conventionally, and it was like 1.99 by 2.00 in their field notes. And I scratched my head forever about that monument, and I decided to reject it, basically saying, I don't think this monument was set in a right position to start with. I think that was a blunder. And exact 2 by 2 at a top of slope, and I'm the scenario in my head was, look, this monument, I know, I worked at that company at a time, although not on that project. And I'm going, look, I know how it happens in the field. The party chief is going to set the main controlling monuments, and middle or the second part of the day, he's going to decide that his chainman needs a little bit of training, and he says, yeah, there's a couple of these extra monuments, can you go set them? And somebody blundered the monument along the way. On a new subdivision, there was no, it was all in open landscaping. There was no position to where the taking, what am I trying to say? There was no clear evidence of who took position to what level. The slope was all looked like it was maintained by one place, by one gardener. So I ended up arguing that that monument was just set as a blunder. The map checker had issues with it, and the map checker actually decided that, well, I think we should say that due to slope stability, that monument has moved or something to that effect, that probably was seismic activity, which I didn't really buy, but to accommodate the map checker, I said, okay, fine, we'll put that explanation on the map. Because if there was seismic activity, this was like a 20 foot slope just short of needing a bench. So it was a pretty significant slope. If that slope has settled, if there was some seismic activity, there would have been other disturbances. A monument 10 feet away from it was in a fitting record perfectly. So what do you do with that monument?
Yeah. What do you do? I mean, I found one that was original stone that had slid, but it was obviously slid. It was in a rock area. It was a rock in rocks, and it obviously slid. So that's an easier decision. That's a challenge. That's the biggest challenge we have as surveyors, right? Of taking that evidence and getting to a point where you feel it's defensible and that you can pull the trigger. Sometimes we feel like surveys never end and they're going to forever, and that at some point for our clients, for our business, we'd like to sit there and stew and keep collecting the evidence, but at some point we have to hit stop, right? And is that stop, look, I just don't have enough to go on, I've got to end this and have that discussion with my client? Or is this stop, look, I don't feel great about this, but I understand where I got, and I can relay that through words and graphics to a future surveyor, right, or to a judge, but you have to hit stop at some point.
And I think
we're getting right.
Yeah,
go ahead, Trent.
Just on that, your last comment, right? In which we harp on almost every time, and the map must be defendable, right? You have to be comfortable to defend it. Can you spend 46 days on the stand being cross-examined, right? Is how good is your survey? So that's the ultimate decision, right? And you got to be able to defend it no matter what. If somebody calls you tomorrow or calls you in 15 years, you have to at least have the information readily available to go back and look and see what you did. And things may not come, depends on where your survey is, right? 20 years from now could be, was a rural area 20 years ago is now, turned into a little mountain community or something. And so you got to be able to remember what you did and have those files and have all that research and backups. So
yeah, where is it, defending it, future time frame, but also being humble enough to change your mind if new evidence comes up.
Yeah. Oh, of course.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. There's a couple more things I wanted to hit real fast. I didn't plan on spending a ton of time talking about them, but there's a couple really great highlights. Some of this we've already hit before. So I just want to go through and make sure I don't miss it. 5.9. It's got, let me get over there. It's got a list here. Talks about sufficiency, amount, and kind of evidence to prove original corner. So they talked about the preponderance of evidence, right? How much evidence do you need? And so that gets into that discussion too of how defensible is it? Do you have a preponderance of evidence, or is it beyond a reasonable doubt? Well, we just need a preponderance of evidence. We need enough to say that we've done our due diligence to come up with that. So they've got a list there of kind of how do you hit that mark. They go through original corners and markings, disturbed evidence, evidence in writing, trees, evidence of trees. I mean, some of this that urban surveyors never ever deal with. Some of it they do. Our rural guys do. I've never had to go chase down blaze trees. And I've worked in some rural areas, but it's just nothing I've encountered. So knowing this is here is a great thing. If you ever get into that, here's where you can jump back into some of those things and looking at it. And they go through some great stuff of how do you do it and what do you look at. We've been talking about Principle 9, their chapter or their section header 5.15, chain of history of corners and monuments. Oh no, we didn't get to 9. But change in history of corners and monuments. Other than the original monument, the best evidence of a monument's original position is a continuous chain of history by acceptable records, usually written back to time of the original survey and its monumentation. So some states have, every time you visit a monument, you've got to put a corner record in, right? So year after year, you can see a chain of evidence that that monument's always been there. Some states don't require, a continual evidence of a corner visitation, a monument visitation. So it could be 20, 30 years since that monument record was updated. So how do you know that that's the same corner you're looking at, especially if someone's changed it and not, or reset it and not maintain evidence of that. So I think it's a great one to think about, take back to our state societies, or think about how are we monumenting section corners over time. Summary of competent parole evidence and witness evidence for rule corners and monumentation. So 5.18, the summary of competent parole evidence. It's got some great lists there. The general rule is that testimony may not contradict, vary, or modify writings. Testimony in general is limited to these 5 items. So we can read through those. We talked about passing calls, possession evidence. For possession, 5.20. For possession to represent evidence of the original lines created by the original surveyor, the following 5 facts should apply. So another list of, you're in this situation, here's 5 things to look at. 5.21, common report, reputation, hearsay. So the federal rules of evidence. And this is one we've talked about quite a bit through the chapters here. So they reference that here in this chapter again. What are the federal rules of evidence, and how do you kind of incorporate that into your decision making? And then 5.22, evidence of fences to prove boundaries. They've got some great case law and some examples in there from different states. Texas, from the West, from Michigan. So if you didn't read that or want to read that over, those are some great things. Finally, I just want to read the last couple chapters here. There is a great story that they present. It says, the requirement of any retracement, either in meets and bounds states or in a GLO state, is basic to all. Find the footsteps of the original surveyor who created the original lines. Yet it is impossible to follow the original surveyor, in all that he or she left is the evidence of the footsteps. Thus, the responsibility of the retracing surveyor is very simple: to find the evidence the creating surveyors left. At times, the surveyor will find that a thin thread of evidence is all that remains. The key factors are being persistent and asking questions. It shows figure 5.16 is a good example. The original GLO surveyor marked a 10-inch red oak in 1889 as one of 4 witness trees to a section corner. Most of that township had been farmed and had been granted to a tribe of Native Americans in a reservation. In a retracement of the township, little evidence was recovered. A definite positive identification of some evidence was needed. After surveying several miles of line to locate a lost corner, and after having a local Native American watch these efforts for several days, the surveyor asked the Native American, "Do you know where the government corner was?" He responded, "Yes, I do." He promptly went to his barn and retrieved the stump of one of the original bearing trees, with actual scribing still visible, showed it to the surveyor. Then he went over to a point approximately 15 feet from where the surveyor had been digging, a point that had a precision of location, placed his foot on the ground at a point that had an accurate location, and said, "It came from here." The surveyor took his shovel, dug down, and found a piece of pottery that the person had placed in the hole from when the stump had been removed. On discussion, the Native American stated that when the road was constructed, the contractors pulled all 4 trees and burned 3 of them in a brush pile. He could not let them destroy the tree that indicated where his land was located. He kept that stump for over 40 years. He often wondered why no other surveyor in those 40 years had not asked him that one important question: do you know where the corner is? So
Yeah.
there's our inspirational thought to end the discussion tonight. That sometimes all you have to do is ask.
Absolutely. That is fantastic. I was going to, I stopped sharing for 1 second. I was going to show you going back to some maps and surveys. Is my PDF showing over here?
Yep.
Yeah. So that this is a little bit, this is a pretty in-depth survey that we've been messing with for a while, but you know, talking about knowing what you did in the past and what evidence you had found. He goes a little crazy on how he kind of details some of the monuments. Let me even like this one, he shows the owl cap was, you know, kind of ran through even with a saw cut and stuff like that. So this is one of the guys in the office drafts this up, but you know, it's no question on what monuments we found at the time, right? And what, how they were in the field and that kind of stuff. So that's the kind of, if you got some kind of crazy survey that you're not super comfortable with, and you may not remember, right, years down the road, you could obviously do some kind of coordinate tables and monument tables that definitely highlight some stuff. So just a thought, but
I love this.
yeah,
That's a great one. Yeah.
it's pretty crazy. So it's a good one. But yeah, just again, helping you remember what things are going to be like, you know, 15, 20 years from now and what you found at the time. So
Well, our data collectors now, I mean, I don't know. I know our crews don't use it enough, but right there on the data collector, you can create a monument record for them, right? You can take a picture, store it to the point.
Yeah.
You know, take a bunch of pictures and store it to the point. And I know our crews don't use it near enough, but there's a lot that our technology, we got into that last time, technology is evidence. There's a lot that we can do to support, improve, and monument that even if we're not doing traditional field notes. I know Peter Cox on LinkedIn. She posted a question, right? How many of you guys are using traditional field notes? And it was kind of surprised to see how many people weren't, and then who was using a mixture of the both. And you know, there's different ways of doing that. So look at what technologies you have to use, and old-fashioned paper sketches of it, you know, or rubbing of the monument.
Right.
That's what it takes. But whatever you got to do to help yourself remember it, it's great.
Yeah, I require pictures on my boundary surveys. We actually, our GIS department wrote a little app that's based on survey 123, and I have a monument recovery form. There's fields that I want them to fill. It takes a snapshot of of Google Maps of where the monument is as a vicinity map. It takes a shot of, I have them take a couple of shots of the vicinity where they found the monument, because I want to know what that whole area looks like at a time they found it. If they searched and found nothing, I want a picture that evidences how hard they searched. If I told them to dig to bedrock, I want to see a picture of bedrock. And I want to have a picture of the monument immediate surrounding, you know, because sometimes if they tell me monument is disturbed or maybe disturbed, or should I call this disturbed, great, show me a picture. And I want a close-up of the writing on the monument itself, and that gets extracted with the field notes, and I get a set of PDFs, and we call them monument recovery sheets. And they hate me for making them do that in the field, but I love it when I have to interpret the boundary.
Idaho requires that. They have a requirement for any time you visit a monument. They're one of those states, and they require a picture of you looking through the monument. So the monument has to be in the picture looking north, south, east, and west. And that's part of their monument recovery
That's awesome.
sheets.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good discussion. I like it's going to lead, these conversations are blending over from chapter to chapter, obviously, as we continue to hit the evidence side of things, but it's just setting it up for some deeper conversations, I think, as we get deeper into the book. So,
and we appreciate the new guys that chimed in today too.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you for not being shy and jumping in. That really helps the discussion.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah, questions and questions that people are grappling with, and hearing how these principles are applied in practice, in and the different regional differences too, how they vary.
Absolutely.
It's always an eye opener.
Awesome. All right, everybody. What are we at? 24th, I think, right? That's the next one. Yeah, 24th.
Yeah.
August 24th. So we'll roll to chapter 6, calculations and measurements of it as evidence. So that'll be another fun one. It was a good
Thank
chapter.
you.
Hey, thanks, guys.
Awesome.
Have a great
Okay.
evening.
Guys,
Have a good
see you
night.
later.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.